We are building the welcome message project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. Previously, we saw how we could use try and except to make our code a little bit more robust. Before moving forward, however, I thought it's a good idea to take a step back and just look at a broad classification of errors that happen when we program. In fact, errors and programming go hand in hand. When we write code, unfortunately, things can go wrong. I would say things almost always do go wrong. If you remember, one of the first things I tell students when they move into Python is that, well, let's not be scared of these errors, because errors are good. They tell us what we are getting wrong. They give us an opportunity to fix those things. So, there's something a part and parcel of programming, but still it's kind of like good to just sort of take a high level view of this. Broadly speaking, we can classify errors into three categories: syntax errors, logic errors, and runtime exceptions. Now, let's understand these one by one. Syntax errors are essentially asking interpreter to do things that it just cannot understand. For example, let's say I want to print a string called test on the screen. I want to give the print command, but while writing the print command, I end up writing, let's say, P in capital letters. I end up leaving a space, for instance, let's say in, I and N. These are all syntax errors, because this is just wrong syntax, right? It's just like wrong usage of the language. The interpreter wouldn't know what you mean by this. As a human being, we understand, okay, you would probably want to print, but interpreter is tuned to looking at, let's say, print with all small letters. So it wouldn't know what is going on here, and it will say this is syntax error. Now, we have certainly seen this before, and we have fixed this at time error. So if, for example, let's say another syntax error would be if I have an apostrophe here, but no apostrophe here. So that's all syntax errors. We have seen this before. Logic errors can be a little bit more tricky to catch because they represent correct syntax, but program not doing what we want it to do. For instance, we may have a program to, let's say, pick out all even numbers from a list, but due to some error, perhaps in the modular function, in the way we interpreted the code, the way we wrote the code, perhaps the program ends up picking up all the odd numbers instead of the even numbers. Now that program will run, that program will not crash, but that program may end up creating a wrong output. Now, obviously, this is also something we have seen before. We do not want this. We spoke about, correct algorithms, efficient algorithms, and so on. Logic errors should not be there in the code. But again, it takes practice, it takes iterations, it takes testing to figure out if there are logic errors. What we are interested in as far as this project goes, however, is a situation where we have what we call exceptions, runtime errors. Basically, correct syntax, correct logic, but during runtime something unexpected happens. For example, in the case of short form, I expected my user to give me all strings, but my user by mistake gave me an integer. Now that is something, it's not an error on my side. It's in fact coming, you can say, from the users, let's say the way of the function is being called, but I need to handle that. That happens at runtime. So this is what we are primarily interested in. In Python, of course, and we have seen this before, sometimes runtime errors can also happen with no, let's say, mistake on the user's part, primarily because of indentation. Sometimes we may put certain code in a way where, we end up in a situation that, look, because of indentation, certain part of the code never got exercised until a given condition happened, which means we may have some runtime errors there. So some kind of errors coming up there. But that aside, broadly, let's make a point that we are interested in a situation where user gives us something which was not expected. So that's what we are looking at. Let's just try to briefly understand this in context of the simple function when we have the short form, let's say star names. Now, many things can go wrong here, right? For example, let's say I wrote this code, and I say that I forgot to define what is final. Well, in that case, you know very well that when I come to this statement, final is final plus name 0, that would be an error because my interpreter would say, look, I do not know what is final. Alternatively, I might have defined final is equal to 0. So that's an integer. That again will cause a problem here. But notice these are not errors that are happening because of the user. And in context of this project welcome message, we expect that, look, these errors must have been corrected as we develop the code. In fact, as you know, when we develop the code, when we run the code as we are developing, the interpreter keeps telling us, look, this is an error on this line, on so and so line, maybe this is wrong, and you look at it and you fix it. Python interpreter, as it runs, it gives us these error codes, which are quite helpful to debug. Very useful, in fact. But the point is, for this particular project, we assume that these errors have been taken care. We are primarily interested in what's happening from the outside world, whether it's getting an input from the user or perhaps later on, as we'll see, whether we want to, let's say, go and contact a remote server, things can go wrong at those interfaces. That's what we are interested in, right? So think through this a little bit. Very important to sort of understand what we are doing here, because then the whole picture makes a lot of sense. And in fact, you should at this point just reflect back at all the many errors that you must have faced in your programming journey. Like I said, errors and programming go hand in hand, and we learn through these errors. I hope this discussion was somewhat useful for you to sort of put a context to this whole thing. We will move further in the next video to keep building our welcome message project. If you think this way of learning, where we are always building an activity, trying to think the different concepts in context of that activity, if you think this is something that you are interested in, look at our website, www.ybyte.in, because to us, this is a very, very effective way of learning Python programming. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.